A dead man is running your life right now. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. Every time you pull out a dollar bill and trust that it means something, that's him. Every time a politician gets caught in a scandal and the press slaps Gate onto the end of it, Iran-gate, Monica-gate, Climate-gate, that's him. Every time you breathe air in an American city and don't choke to death on industrial exhaust, him. Every time a diplomat boards a flight to Beijing, or a news anchor talks about U.S.-China relations as though they are simply a natural feature of the world, him. Every time a young man registers for the draft and discovers he doesn't have to, him again. Richard Milhous Nixon died on April 22, 1994. He has not stopped working since. You think you know who he was. You've seen the caricature, the ski-slope nose, the sweating upper lip, the two-fingered V signs thrust toward the sky, the voice cracking under the weight of its own dishonesty. You know Watergate. You know he resigned. You know he was the bad guy. You are wrong. Or rather, you are massively, dangerously incomplete. Because the real Nixon is not a villain in a history textbook. The real Nixon is a mirror. And when you look into it long enough, something looks back that makes you deeply uncomfortable. Let's begin where it always begins. With the wound. Yorba Linda, California. 1913. A lemon farm that barely produces lemons. A small wooden house that Nixon's father Frank built with his own hands, and built badly. Cold floors, drafty walls. A family that prayed before meals not out of habit, but out of genuine need. Because need was the defining texture of their existence. Frank Nixon was a loud, combative, unsuccessful man who tried his hand at everything. Streetcar operator, rancher, oil prospector, and mastered none of it. He was not cruel exactly, but he was the kind of father whose presence in a room raises the barometric pressure. He argued. He blustered. He was certain he was right even when the evidence, the dead lemons, the failing business, the mounting debt, said otherwise. Hannah Nixon was the opposite. Quiet, devout, Quaker in the deepest sense. Not the cultural costume of it, but the marrow. Neighbors who knew her described her with words usually reserved for figures in stained glass. Patient, selfless. A woman who worked without complaint and gave without record. Between these two poles, Richard grew up. And he grew up fast, because he had to. 2 of his brothers died young. Harold, the eldest, wasted away from tuberculosis over years, while Hannah nursed him in a sanitarium in Arizona, and the family stretched thinner than paper to cover the bills. Arthur, the youngest, was gone at 7 from tubercular meningitis. Richard watched his mother absorb these losses with a composure that was either saintly or heartbreaking, depending on how you looked at it. He got up before sunrise. He drove the family truck to the market at 4 a.m. to pick up vegetables. He worked in the store. He studied. He won debate competitions. He was not charming. Even his admirers rarely used that word. But he was relentless. He had the engine of someone who has something to prove and hasn't decided yet whether to prove it to the world or to themselves. Here is where the wound opens. Richard Nixon was accepted to Harvard. Full scholarship offered. He couldn't go. The family couldn't afford the travel, the incidentals, the margin. He stayed in California. He went to Whittier College, a small Quaker school. He was brilliant there, but it was not Harvard. It was never Harvard. Then Duke Law School. He graduated 3rd in his class. He applied to the established New York firms, the silk stocking firms, the ones with wood-paneled offices and clients who'd been wealthy for 3 generations. They didn't take him. The doors didn't open. He went back to Whittier. He practiced small-time law. And he carried that rejection, that specific class-inflected rejection, for the rest of his life. It never healed. It calcified into something harder and more dangerous than bitterness. It became the architecture of his psychology. The political climb, when it came, was fast and ruthless. 1946. Nixon is 33 years old, a Navy veteran, and a complete unknown. The Republican Party in California's 12th Congressional District needs a candidate to run against the 5-term Democrat Jerry Voorhis. Nixon takes the job. He runs a campaign that today would be called a masterclass in negative politics. He links Voorhis, a mild, decent, liberal man, to communist sympathizers, to radical unions, to forces that wanted to tear apart the American way of life. None of it was quite true. Most of it was innuendo dressed in the language of patriotic alarm. He won by 15,000 votes. Then came Alger Hiss. Hiss was a Harvard-educated State Department official. Everything Nixon was not. Elegant establishment. The kind of man who moved through Washington like he'd been born there, because in every sense that mattered, he had been. In 1948, Nixon pursued him through the House Un-American Activities Committee, insisting against the skepticism of almost everyone around him that Hiss had passed secrets to the Soviets. Nixon was right. Or at least he was right enough. Hiss was convicted of perjury. And overnight Richard Nixon was famous. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower chose him as a running mate. Nixon was 39 years old. And then, almost immediately, the first crisis. A newspaper story broke revealing that California businessmen had set up a private fund to cover Nixon's political expenses. In the climate of that moment, where accusations of corruption were flying in every direction, it looked bad. Eisenhower's advisors wanted him dropped from the ticket. Nixon did something no politician had done before. He bought television time. He sat in a studio with his wife Pat beside him, and he spoke directly into the camera for 32 minutes. He laid out his finances. He explained the fund. He got emotional. He talked about his daughter's cloth coats and one specific gift he would never return. A Cocker Spaniel named Checkers, which his daughters loved. It was mawkish. It was calculated. It was brilliant. The switchboards lit up. The telegrams flooded in. The simple Americans, the ones who didn't go to Harvard, the ones who drove trucks and worked in stores and knew what it meant to scrimp. They heard themselves in Nixon's voice, and they responded. He had discovered something that would define American politics for the next 70 years. You could go around the gatekeepers. You could bypass the editors, the party bosses, the establishment arbiters of what was respectable. You could talk directly to people at home, in their living rooms, in their grief and their pride and their resentment. And they would listen. 1960. The most famous debate in television history. Nixon arrives looking pale and underweight, having refused makeup, having spent the campaign grinding himself to exhaustion. John F. Kennedy, tanned, rested, luminous, stands beside him. 70 million people watch. People who hear the debate on the radio think Nixon won. People who watch on television think Kennedy won by a mile. Nixon loses the election by the narrowest of margins. 1962. He runs for governor of California. Loses again. At the post-defeat press conference, tired and unguarded, he looks at the reporters who've covered him for years with barely concealed contempt and says, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Everyone writes the obituary. The career is over. Everyone is wrong. 1968. The United States is on fire, not metaphorically. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in April. Robert Kennedy is assassinated in June. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago becomes a battle zone. Vietnam is swallowing young men and producing nothing but grief and division. The country feels like it's coming apart at the seams. Into this, Richard Nixon, older, calmer, remade. He speaks two words that cut through the noise like a scalpel: law and order. He deploys what historians would later call the Southern strategy, a careful, deniable, but unmistakable signal to white Southern voters who resented the Civil Rights Act, who felt their world changing too fast in the wrong direction. He didn't use racial language. He didn't have to. The signal was in the frequency, not the words. The political map of the United States shifted that year. It has not shifted back. And there is something darker still. There are serious, documented reasons to believe, based on FBI surveillance records, contemporaneous notes, and the later admissions of key participants, that the Nixon campaign made back-channel contact with the South Vietnamese government, encouraging them to delay peace negotiations until after the election. Lyndon Johnson knew. He called it treason on a private phone call that was recorded. He did not go public. Hubert Humphrey lost the election by less than 1% of the popular vote. The war continued for 5 more years. More than 20,000 additional American soldiers died. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. Richard Nixon was elected the 37th President of the United States on November 5, 1968. The man who everyone had buried, twice, was going to the White House. And he was going there carrying everything: the wound, the engine, the genius, the paranoia, the resentment, and the unshakable, terrifying belief that he alone understood what America truly was. He was right about that last part. That was the problem. Here is the thing they never teach you in school. The man who became the symbol of American political corruption, the name synonymous with abuse of power, with lying, with the slow-motion collapse of trust in government, that same man signed more progressive domestic legislation than almost any Democratic president of the 20th century. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the central paradox of Richard Nixon, and until you hold both halves of it in your hands at the same time, you don't understand him at all. You don't understand what he built. You don't understand what he destroyed. And you certainly don't understand why the room he built is the room you're still living in today. Let's start with the construction. Nixon enters the White House in January of 1969 and almost immediately begins doing things that would make a modern conservative's head spin. He creates the Environmental Protection Agency, not through congressional pressure, not reluctantly, but by executive order in 1970. Because he looked at the rivers catching fire and the air turning gray over Los Angeles and decided this was a problem worth solving. He signs the Clean Air Act. He signs the Clean Water Act. He signs the National Environmental Policy Act. The man who gave us the EPA was Richard Nixon. He expands food stamps. He expands funding for the arts and humanities. He indexes Social Security to inflation, which is why your grandmother's benefits don't erode every year. He proposes something called the Family Assistance Plan, a guaranteed minimum income for every American family, a floor below which no one would be allowed to fall. The idea is radical enough that it terrifies both the left and the right, and it dies in the Senate. But he proposed it. Nixon proposed something closer to universal basic income than any president before or since. He ends the military draft. He lowers the voting age to 18. He signs Title IX into law, which transforms women's participation in American education and athletics in ways still reverberating today. He declares a national war on cancer in 1971, the National Cancer Act, committing federal resources to research at a scale never attempted before. He approves the Space Shuttle program. He restructures federal funding to give states more autonomy over how they spend money, a philosophy he calls New Federalism, which reshapes the relationship between Washington and the rest of the country. And then there is health care. In 1974, Richard Nixon proposes a comprehensive national health insurance plan that would require employers to cover their workers and create federally subsidized coverage for everyone else. It is, by any honest accounting, close to universal health care. Ted Kennedy, the liberal lion, the man who spent his career fighting for this exact cause, initially refuses to negotiate because he believes a better deal is coming. Watergate then consumes the presidency. The bill dies. Kennedy spent the rest of his life saying it was the greatest political mistake he ever made. The man who nearly gave America universal health care was Richard Nixon. Now look outward. February of 1972. Air Force One descends through clouds over Beijing. Richard Nixon, the man who built his entire early career on the politics of anti-communism, who rode the Red Scare into Congress, who made his name hunting Alger Hiss, steps off the plane and shakes hands with Premier Zhou Enlai. The world holds its breath. It works precisely because of who Nixon is. No one can accuse him of being soft on communism. The political armor he built over 20 years is the very thing that makes this move possible. Only Nixon, as the phrase goes, could go to China. He understood something counterintuitive about power. Sometimes your reputation is your greatest strategic asset, and you spend it most wisely by doing the thing no one expects. The Shanghai Communique, the document signed at the end of that visit, begins the normalization of relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It pulls China out of isolation and into the global economy. It redraws the Cold War map. Every trade deal, every diplomatic negotiation, every argument about China that fills your newsfeed today, it begins in that handshake. He pursues détente with the Soviet Union simultaneously. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, produced the first treaty between the superpowers to actually limit nuclear weapons. Two countries that have spent decades pointing the end of the world at each other sit down and agree, in writing, to cap the madness at a specific number. The man who did this was the same man who wept with resentment at his own reflection for 30 years. But the darkness runs just as deep. Vietnam. Nixon inherits a catastrophe and makes it worse before he makes it better, and then, arguably, makes it worse again. He pursues what he calls the madman theory. He wants North Vietnam and the Soviet Union to believe he is unstable enough to do anything, including using nuclear weapons, so they will negotiate out of fear. Kissinger delivers the message. The strategy produces no breakthrough. Meanwhile, Nixon secretly expands the war. He orders massive bombing campaigns over Cambodia, a neutral country, without telling Congress, without telling the American public. The bombing goes on for 14 months before it leaks. When students protest at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guardsmen open fire. 4 students die. Nixon's public response is cold. The country fractures further. And then there is the war on drugs. In 1971, Nixon declares drug abuse public enemy number 1 and launches the federal war on drugs. It sounds like public health policy. It is not. Years later, Nixon's domestic policy advisor John Ehrlichman gives an interview that belongs in every history class ever taught. He says, and these are his words, not an interpretation, that the Nixon White House had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black Americans. They couldn't make it illegal to be against the war or to be black. But they could associate the left with marijuana and black Americans with heroin, criminalize both heavily, and disrupt those communities. Arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings. The war on drugs was a political weapon disguised as public health policy. That weapon has now been firing for more than 50 years. It has cost more than $1 trillion. It has incarcerated more human beings than any prison system in the history of civilization. The United States today holds roughly 25% of the world's prison population, while containing only 4% of the world's people. The architecture of that reality was drawn in the Nixon White House. 1971, August 15th. Nixon appears on television and announces that the United States is suspending the convertibility of the dollar to gold, unilaterally, without consulting allies, without warning. The Bretton Woods system, the international monetary framework built after World War II, the agreement that gave the post-war global economy its structure, collapses overnight. From this moment forward, the dollar is backed by nothing except the collective agreement of humanity that it means something. Every currency on earth floats freely against every other currency. The foreign exchange market, a market that today trades more than $7 trillion every single day, is born from this moment. Your money is a shared hallucination that Nixon made permanent. Now we come to the machine, because Watergate is not a story about a botched burglary. That is the version that makes it a contained event, something with a beginning and an end, a crime and a consequence, a tidy lesson about the limits of presidential power. That version is comfortable. It is also completely wrong. Watergate is the moment one gear of a much larger machine slipped into public view. The machine had many gears. There was the enemies list, a literal document maintained by the White House, naming journalists, politicians, academics, and activists that Nixon wanted targeted. Targeted how? By IRS audits, by FBI surveillance, by the withdrawal of federal contracts, by the orchestrated destruction of reputations. 200 enemies on the list. 200 people whose lives the most powerful office in the world was quietly trying to ruin. There were the dirty tricks operations, a covert campaign of political sabotage run during the 1972 election. Forged letters, stolen documents, disrupted campaign events, spies planted inside Democratic campaigns, all coordinated from inside the White House. The Watergate break-in, 5 men caught inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the early hours of June 17, 1972, was just one operation among many. It happened to go wrong. And the cover-up that followed, the hush money, the destroyed evidence, the perjury, the firing of the special prosecutor in what became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, was Nixon's attempt to hide not just this one crime, but the entire system behind it. The tapes destroyed him. Nixon had installed a voice-activated recording system in the Oval Office. When their existence was revealed, the legal and political battle to obtain them consumed 14 months. When the transcripts were released, the country read them and heard a president not as a tragic hero brought down by a single flaw, but as a man who spoke casually about obstruction, about payments, about using the instruments of government against private citizens. On August 9, 1974, Richard Nixon stood in the East Room of the White House, said goodbye to his staff, climbed into a helicopter, and became the only president in American history to resign the office. The aftermath runs in 2 directions at once. Gerald Ford pardons him 1 month later. The country erupts. Ford's approval rating drops 30 points overnight, and many historians believe the pardon cost him the 1976 election. But Ford will say, until his dying day, that the country needed to move forward, and moving forward required closing the wound. Nixon retreats to San Clemente, California. He is 61 years old, in poor health, politically radioactive, facing potential criminal prosecution. He writes his memoirs. He gives the famous interview to David Frost in 1977, one of the most watched television events of the decade. He says, in a moment that gets replayed for the next half-century, when the president does it, that means it is not illegal. He also, in that same interview, comes closer to a genuine apology than he ever will again. He says he let the American people down. He says he let himself down. For just a moment, the armor cracks, and you see underneath it not a monster, but a man, a deeply damaged, extraordinarily capable, catastrophically flawed man who wanted to be great and became something else instead. He rebuilds. He writes 9 books. He travels. He advises. Ronald Reagan calls him. George H.W. Bush calls him. Even Bill Clinton calls him near the end. Nixon becomes a kind of shadow statesman, the man no one wants to be photographed with, but everyone wants to talk to, because his understanding of geopolitics remains, to his final days, almost unmatched. He dies on April 22, 1994. 5 presidents attend his funeral. Clinton delivers the eulogy and asks the country to measure Nixon by the full scope of his life, not only by its worst chapter. Here is what you are left with. Nixon was not a hypocrite who preached values he secretly despised. He was something more complicated and more troubling. A man whose greatest strengths and deepest pathologies were the exact same qualities, expressed in different directions. The paranoia that made him a brilliant strategist, always anticipating the enemy's move, always seeing around corners, was the same paranoia that built the enemy's list, that ordered the break-in, that could not tolerate the existence of opponents without needing to destroy them. The resentment that drove him from a lemon farm in Yorba Linda to the most powerful office on earth, that hunger, that refusal to accept the verdict of the privileged, was the same resentment that made him incapable of accepting legitimate defeat or legitimate criticism. The will that made him resurrection-proof, that brought him back from 2 career-ending losses to win the presidency. That iron, grinding, magnificent will was the same will that refused to stop, refused to let go, refused to hand over the tapes and trust that the country might forgive him. He built the clean air you breathe and the prison system that swallowed a generation. He opened China and poisoned domestic politics with the Southern strategy. He nearly gave you universal health care and launched the most expensive failed policy in American history. He destroyed the gold standard and built the modern world economy. He proved that a president could be removed from office and proved simultaneously that removal was nearly impossible. He built the room you live in. And as he walked out of the White House for the last time, arms raised, fingers spread, in that unmistakable double V, whether victory or peace, he never quite said. He left something behind that no pardon could touch and no funeral could bury. He left you with the knowledge that power can be abused at the highest level. He left you with the suspicion that it probably is. He left you with the reflex, healthy and corrosive in equal measure, of not trusting the people who run the room he built. That reflex is his most enduring legacy. You carry it right now, whether you know it or not.